The fluorescent lights of the courthouse hallway cast harsh shadows across Margaret Whitmore's tired face as she clutched her worn leather purse against her chest. 25 years of marriage had taught her the art of becoming invisible, and today she practiced that skill with desperate precision. The cold marble bench beneath her seemed to leach what little warmth remained from her body as she listened to the animated conversation happening just 15 feet away. Before we dive deeper into Margaret's story, I'm curious about something. Where are you watching this from today? Are you in a courthouse of your own, perhaps dealing with legal matters? Or are you safe at home like I hope Margaret will be soon? Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're tuning in from, because stories like this happen everywhere, and sometimes the quiet ones surprise us all. Richard Whitmore stood at the center of his expensive legal team like a king holding court, his voice carrying across the hallway with the confidence of a man who had never truly been challenged. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his custom-tailored suit pressed to crisp perfection, and his laugh rang out with the particular cruelty that only comes from someone who believes they hold all the power. "Margaret, this is going to be the easiest case we've handled all year," proclaimed Thomas Blackwood, Richard's lead attorney, adjusting his Rolex as he spoke. The woman obviously has no understanding of business, no assets to speak of, and frankly, no backbone to fight for anything meaningful. We'll have the preliminary hearing wrapped up before lunch and be filing the final papers by week's end. Richard's response came with that familiar chuckle that had once charmed Margaret during their college years, but now made her stomach turn. "You know, Tom, I almost feel sorry for her. 25 years of marriage, and she still doesn't understand how the real world works. I've been handling every financial decision, every business move, every investment. She's been playing house while I built an empire." The memories flooded back unbidden as Margaret sat in her enforced silence. She remembered the gradual erosion that had started so subtly she hadn't recognized it as warfare. First, Richard had suggested she didn't need to worry her pretty little head about the boring details of money management. Then he had smiled patronizingly when she asked about their investments, explaining that business was too complicated for someone without his education and experience. By year 10, he was actively discouraging her from attending social events where financial discussions might arise, telling friends with mock affection that Margaret preferred domestic pursuits to the harsh realities of commerce. The sound of designer heels clicking against marble announced the arrival of Jessica Carmichael, Richard's 28-year-old assistant, who had somehow become much more than that over the past 18 months. Jessica's platinum blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders in waves that cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget, and her emerald dress clung to curves that had never carried children or endured the slow erosion of a loveless marriage. "Darling, you look absolutely victorious already," Jessica purred, sliding her manicured hand along Richard's arm with proprietary familiarity. "I can't wait until this unpleasant business is finished and we can start our real life together. The house in the Hamptons is going to be perfect for entertaining, and the yacht will be ready for our Mediterranean cruise by summer." Richard's chest swelled with pride as he gestured toward Margaret without bothering to lower his voice. "See that pathetic creature over there? 25 years I've supported her, clothed her, given her a lifestyle she could never have achieved on her own, and this is how she repays me. Fortunately, she's too simple to understand the complexity of our financial arrangements, so this whole charade will be over quickly." Margaret's court-appointed lawyer, David Chun, approached with a stack of papers that seemed to overwhelm his slight frame. His nervousness was palpable as he fumbled through documents, occasionally dropping papers that scattered across the polished floor. Margaret observed his anxiety with the same detached calm she had cultivated during years of Richard's increasingly public humiliations. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have to be honest with you," David whispered, settling beside her on the bench. "Your husband's legal team is extremely well-prepared and well-funded. They've presented a very compelling case that shows you as having minimal involvement in the acquisition of marital assets. I'm going to do my best for you, but I think we should consider any reasonable settlement offer they might present." Margaret nodded quietly, her gray eyes betraying nothing of the thoughts racing through her mind. She had perfected this expression of resigned acceptance over years of practice, wearing it like armor that deflected suspicion and invited underestimation. Let them think her broken. Let them believe their own narrative about the helpless housewife who had contributed nothing of value to the marriage they were so eager to dissolve. The courthouse began filling with observers as word spread about what was expected to be a straightforward divorce proceeding. Richard's business partners arrived in their expensive suits, ready to testify about Margaret's complete absence from any meaningful business discussions. Country club wives whispered among themselves about poor Richard being taken advantage of by a woman who had clearly married above her station. Among the gathering crowd, Margaret noticed the familiar faces of people she had once considered friends. Patricia Westfield caught her eye and offered a sympathetic smile that carried undertones of pity and superiority. Even Margaret's own sister, Helen, had called the night before to gently suggest that fighting Richard's obvious advantages would only prolong her suffering and make her look vindictive. The mouse who never roared, Richard announced to his entourage, gesturing toward Margaret with theatrical disdain. 25 years of marriage, and I can count on two hands the number of times she's expressed an opinion about anything important. She's going to sit there in her little thrift store dress, nod politely when the judge explains that adultery doesn't entitle her to assets she never helped acquire, and hopefully disappear quietly into whatever small life awaits women like her. Margaret's fingers traced the worn leather of her purse, feeling the weight of the contents within. The brass clasp had belonged to her mother, and opening it always brought back memories of a different time when her voice had mattered and her thoughts had been valued. But that was before she had learned the devastating power of strategic silence, before she had discovered that sometimes the most dangerous weapon was the willingness to let others underestimate you completely. As the courthouse clock chimed 9:30, Margaret rose from her bench with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years moving through the world without drawing attention. Her simple navy dress and sensible shoes marked her as unremarkable among the designer suits and obvious wealth surrounding her, exactly as she had intended. Today would be the culmination of careful planning that had taken her 2 years to orchestrate, but Richard's team saw only what they expected to see. A woman defeated before the battle had even begun. The court clerk emerged to announce that proceedings would begin in 10 minutes, and Margaret watched as Richard's confidence reached new heights. He was already discussing post-divorce business plans with his partners, making jokes about finally being free to make decisions without consulting someone who wouldn't understand them anyway. Margaret took her place at the defendant's table, maintaining the posture of resigned defeat that had served her so well. But behind her carefully constructed mask of helplessness, her mind was already 3 moves ahead, anticipating every argument Richard's team would make and preparing for the moment when 25 years of strategic silence would finally pay dividends that none of them could imagine. The courtroom fell into respectful silence as Judge Harrison Matthews called the proceedings to order, his weathered face surveying the assembled parties with the practiced efficiency of someone who had presided over thousands of domestic disputes. Richard Whitmore straightened his tie and approached the witness stand with the swagger of a man who had never doubted his own superiority, each step echoing his absolute confidence in the outcome that awaited him. "Your Honor," began Thomas Blackwood with theatrical flourish, "my client Richard Whitmore represents the classic American success story. Through 25 years of tireless dedication, innovative thinking, and calculated risk-taking, he has built a business empire worth over $12 million. Unfortunately, he now finds himself married to a woman who not only fails to appreciate his achievements, but actively seeks to claim ownership of assets she had no role in creating." Richard settled into the witness chair with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. His testimony began with a detailed recounting of his professional achievements, each accomplishment delivered with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this narrative countless times. He spoke of midnight negotiations that secured million-dollar contracts, of strategic partnerships forged through his unique vision, of investment decisions that had multiplied their wealth beyond what any reasonable person could have anticipated. "Your Honor," Richard declared, his voice carrying across the courtroom with practiced confidence, "I have documentation showing that every major business decision over the past 25 years was made independently, without consultation or input from my wife. Margaret has always preferred to focus on domestic matters, which I respected and supported by ensuring she never had to burden herself with the complexities of commerce and finance. Margaret sat motionless at the defendant table, her hands folded in her lap as she watched Richard construct the narrative that would allegedly justify his complete control over their marital assets. She had heard variations of this speech at dinner parties and business functions for years, but never delivered with such calculated cruelty designed to strip her of any claim to dignity or financial security. The questioning turned to Richard's recent expenditures, and his demeanor shifted from professional pride to something approaching vindictive pleasure. He described in elaborate detail the expensive gifts he had purchased for Jessica Carmichael, framing them as rewards for someone who actually understood and appreciated his business acumen. A $50,000 diamond necklace for closing the Henderson account, a luxury sports car for her unwavering support during difficult negotiations, a trip to Monaco that he characterized as a working vacation with someone who could actually contribute meaningfully to business discussions. Your Honor, Margaret never showed any interest in understanding my work, Richard continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone she knew so well. When I tried to explain market fluctuations or investment strategies, her eyes would glaze over. She seemed perfectly content to let me handle all financial decisions while she focused on household management and social activities more suited to her limited capabilities. Jessica Carmichael sat in the gallery's front row, her presence a calculated insult that Richard clearly relished. Her designer ensemble sparkled under the courtroom lights, every piece chosen to demonstrate the lifestyle that Richard claimed Margaret had never deserved or appreciated. Jessica's smile never wavered as Richard detailed their future plans, funded entirely by what he characterized as his personal assets accumulated through his individual efforts. The business ventures we're planning will finally allow me to work with someone who understands modern commerce, Richard announced, gesturing toward Jessica with obvious pride. We've identified several acquisition opportunities that require the kind of sophisticated financial thinking that, frankly, Margaret has never been capable of providing. David Chun rose for cross-examination with visible reluctance, his questions tentative and apologetic as though he was embarrassed to challenge Richard's commanding narrative. When he asked about Margaret's contributions to household management and social networking that had supported Richard's business relationships, Richard's response dripped with condescension that made several observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Your Honor, Richard replied with exaggerated patience, hosting dinner parties and managing household staff hardly constitutes meaningful contribution to business development. Any competent housekeeper could have provided the same services, probably more efficiently and certainly at lower cost than supporting a wife who brought no professional skills or business understanding to our partnership. Margaret watched as Richard's business partners took the stand one by one, each testimony more damaging than the last. Vincent Hartwell, Richard's oldest associate, described Margaret as a pleasant but thoroughly unremarkable presence at business gatherings, someone who smiled appropriately but never contributed anything substantial to conversations about market trends or investment opportunities. His wife, Catherine, followed with observations about Margaret's obvious discomfort during discussions of finance, suggesting that she seemed overwhelmed by topics that Richard handled with natural expertise. The most devastating testimony came from Richard's accountant, Bernard Fitzgerald, whose detailed presentation of financial records painted Margaret as essentially a financial dependent who had consumed resources without generating any measurable return on investment. He presented charts showing Richard's income growth over 25 years, carefully contrasting it with Margaret's complete absence from any revenue-generating activities. Mrs. Whitmore's financial involvement in the marriage has been limited to expenditures rather than contributions, Bernard explained with clinical detachment. While Mr. Whitmore built and expanded multiple income streams, Mrs. Whitmore's activities generated no measurable economic value. She has been, in economic terms, a consumer rather than a producer of household wealth. Throughout this systematic character assassination, Margaret maintained her mask of quiet resignation, occasionally taking notes in a small leather journal that Richard's team dismissed as probably containing grocery lists or social appointments. Her lawyer's objections were half-hearted and easily overruled, creating the impression that even Margaret's legal representation accepted the inevitable outcome. Richard's testimony reached its crescendo as he described Margaret's recent behavior, characterizing her divorce filing as the vindictive act of an ungrateful woman who sought to punish him for finally finding someone who appreciated his achievements. He spoke of Margaret's unreasonable demands for asset division, her apparent delusion that she deserved compensation for what he termed lifestyle support rather than legitimate partnership. "Your Honor," Richard concluded with what appeared to be genuine emotion, "I provided Margaret with 25 years of financial security, social status, and material comfort that exceeded anything she could have achieved independently. Her current attempts to claim ownership of assets she never helped create represents not just legal overreach, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how successful business relationships actually function." Jessica's approving nods from the gallery provided a visual counterpoint to Margaret's supposed inadequacy, her youth and obvious sophistication serving as implicit commentary on Richard's narrative about finally finding an appropriate partner. Several observers began looking at Margaret with the kind of pity reserved for someone whose delusions had been publicly exposed. As Richard stepped down from the witness stand, his confidence had reached levels that bordered on theatrical arrogance. He paused to whisper something to Jessica that caused her to laugh appreciatively, the sound carrying across the courtroom like a victory celebration delivered prematurely but with complete conviction. Judge Matthews called for a brief recess, and Richard's team gathered around him with congratulatory murmurs about a masterful performance that had effectively ended any realistic hope Margaret might have harbored about challenging his narrative. Thomas Blackwood was already drafting settlement papers that would grant Margaret minimal spousal support, while preserving Richard's complete control over all significant assets. Margaret remained seated as the courtroom emptied around her, her notebook closed on the table before her, her expression unchanged by the devastating testimony that had just systematically destroyed her reputation and financial prospects. To any observer, she appeared to be a woman finally accepting the reality of her situation, preparing to surrender gracefully to forces beyond her understanding or control. But appearances, as Richard was about to discover, could be devastatingly misleading when carefully constructed by someone who had spent 25 years learning the art of strategic invisibility. Thomas Blackwood returned to the courtroom after recess with the measured confidence of a predator who had already cornered his prey, his expensive briefcase containing what he clearly believed would be the final nails in Margaret's legal coffin. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the polished wood, creating an atmosphere of finality that seemed to reinforce Richard's team's conviction that victory was not just probable, but inevitable. "Your Honor," Thomas began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to winning high-stakes litigation, "we will now present comprehensive documentation that definitively establishes Mr. Whitmore's sole ownership of all significant marital assets. These documents will demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that Mrs. Whitmore's claims lack both legal foundation and factual basis." The first witness called was Marcus Sterling, Richard's personal accountant for the past 15 years, whose testimony would prove devastating in its clinical precision. Marcus approached the witness stand carrying a thick portfolio of financial documents, each page meticulously organized to support the narrative that Richard had single-handedly created their accumulated wealth through his individual efforts and superior business judgment. "Your Honor," Marcus testified with the detached professionalism that made his words seem like unassailable facts, "these documents clearly show that Mr. Whitmore established his primary business entity, Whitmore Enterprises, as a sole proprietorship in 1998. All subsequent expansion, all major investments, all property acquisitions were executed under his individual authority without any legal participation from Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret watched as Marcus methodically presented bank statements, property deeds, and business registration documents that painted her as completely absent from any meaningful financial decisions. Each document bore Richard's signature alone. Each investment account listed him as the sole beneficial owner. Each business contract identified him as the exclusive decision-maker with full authority to bind the company's assets. The evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine the source of funds for these investments, Marcus continued, producing a series of charts that traced every major financial transaction back to Richard's personal income from his consulting work and business ventures. Mrs. Whitmore had no independent income stream, no business expertise, and no documented involvement in any of the strategic decisions that generated the family's current net worth of approximately $12.7 million. Thomas Blackwood's next witness was Patricia Westfield, a longtime friend from the country club whose testimony would address Margaret's character and capabilities from a social perspective. Patricia approached the witness stand with obvious reluctance, but her words proved even more damaging than Marcus's financial documentation because they came wrapped in the false kindness of concerned friendship. "I've known Margaret for almost 20 years, Patricia began, her voice carrying undertones of pity that made Margaret's supposed inadequacies seem like tragic personal limitations rather than deliberate choices. "She's always been such a sweet, simple person, but honestly, she never seemed to understand Richard's business discussions. At dinner parties, when the conversation turned to investments or market analysis, Margaret would just smile politely and change the subject to something more comfortable for her, like recipes or decorating ideas." The courtroom observers nodded sympathetically as Patricia described Margaret's apparent discomfort with financial complexity, her tendency to defer to Richard's expertise in all matters requiring analytical thinking, her preference for what Patricia termed domestic pursuits over the challenging world of business strategy. Each anecdote reinforced the image of a woman who had been provided with a lifestyle far beyond her natural capabilities and was now ungratefully demanding compensation for assets she had never helped create. Richard's business partner Vincent Hartwell followed with testimony about Margaret's complete absence from any meaningful business discussions over their 25-year association. Vincent described numerous instances where Richard had apologized for Margaret's inability to contribute to conversations about market opportunities, explaining to potential clients that his wife preferred to focus on household management while he handled the complexities of commercial enterprise. "Margaret never attended our strategy meetings," Vincent explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting obvious truths. Richard would occasionally mention that he'd tried to include her in business discussions, but she seemed overwhelmed by concepts like leveraged buyouts or risk assessment analysis. It was clear that she was much happier when Richard handled all the financial decisions, and she could focus on supporting him in more traditional ways. David Chin's cross-examination attempts were increasingly feeble, his questions easily deflected by witnesses who had clearly been well prepared for any challenges to their narrative. When he tried to suggest that Margaret might have provided valuable support through social networking and relationship building, Vincent's response was swift and devastating. "Your Honor," Vincent replied with barely concealed impatience, "hosting cocktail parties and remembering people's birthdays hardly constitutes meaningful business partnership. Any competent social secretary could have provided the same services more efficiently and without expecting ownership stakes in companies they had no role in building." Jessica Carmichael's presence in the gallery had become increasingly prominent as the afternoon progressed, her designer outfits and obvious youth serving as a visual reminder of what Richard characterized as his upgrade to a more suitable partner. Her confident smile and frequent whispered conversations with Richard created an atmosphere of celebration that seemed premature but entirely justified based on the testimony being presented. The most damaging witness proved to be Margaret's own sister Helen, whose reluctant testimony provided the final piece of character assassination that Thomas Blackwood needed to complete his devastating portrait. Helen approached the witness stand with visible discomfort, clearly torn between family loyalty and what she had been convinced was honest recognition of Margaret's limitations. "I love my sister dearly," Helen began with obvious reluctance, "but I have to admit that she's never been particularly good with numbers or business concepts. Even as children, Margaret preferred creative activities while I was the one who helped with our father's accounting. When she married Richard, I was honestly relieved that she'd found someone capable of handling all the financial responsibilities that she'd always found so challenging." Helen's testimony revealed Margaret's apparent dependence on others for financial guidance throughout her entire adult life. Her tendency to avoid situations requiring mathematical analysis or strategic thinking, her obvious gratitude for Richard's willingness to shoulder all economic decision-making responsibilities. Each revelation made Margaret's current legal challenge seem increasingly delusional and vindictive. Thomas Blackwood's closing presentation was a masterpiece of legal theater, combining emotional manipulation with seemingly irrefutable documentary evidence. He painted Richard as a generous provider who had supported an intellectually limited spouse for 25 years, asking nothing in return except gratitude and basic companionship. Margaret's current demands were characterized as the desperate actions of a woman who had finally realized that her meal ticket was disappearing and was attempting to claim ownership of assets she had never understood, much less helped create. Your Honor, Thomas concluded with righteous indignation. Mrs. Whitmore seeks to claim half ownership of businesses she never worked in, properties she never helped purchase, and investments she never contributed to or even comprehended. This represents not just legal overreach, but a fundamental assault on the principle that people should benefit from their own efforts rather than simply existing in proximity to success created by others. Margaret's court-appointed lawyer David Chun seemed completely overwhelmed by the weight of evidence presented against his client, his closing argument barely qualifying as a defense. He spoke briefly about the value of moral support and domestic contributions, but his words lacked conviction and seemed to accept the inevitable outcome that everyone in the courtroom could see approaching. Judge Matthews appeared genuinely sympathetic to Richard's position, his questions during witness examination focusing primarily on clarifying the extent of Margaret's financial dependence rather than challenging the fundamental narrative being constructed about her incompetence and irrelevance. The court clerk and bailiff exchanged glances that suggested even the courthouse staff recognized this as an open-and-shut case. As proceedings adjourned for the day, Richard's confidence had reached levels that bordered on theatrical celebration. He was already discussing post-divorce business plans with his partners, making jokes about finally being free to make important decisions without having to explain them to someone who wouldn't understand them anyway. Jessica's presence at his side reinforced the image of a successful man moving forward with an appropriate partner after years of being held back by an inadequate spouse. Margaret gathered her few papers with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the devastating testimony, her expression revealing nothing of whatever thoughts might be occupying her mind. To every observer in the courtroom, she appeared to be a woman finally accepting the reality of her situation, preparing to surrender gracefully to forces that had always been beyond her understanding or control. But as Margaret walked slowly toward the exit, her worn leather purse clutched against her chest like armor, there was something in her measured steps that suggested the day's humiliations might not have achieved quite the decisive victory that Richard's team believed they had won. The morning of the second day brought an unexpected shift in courtroom atmosphere as David Chin arrived, carrying 3 large document boxes that had not been present during the previous day's proceedings. His nervous demeanor from the day before had been replaced by something approaching quiet determination, and Margaret noticed several members of Richard's legal team exchanging confused glances as they observed the additional materials being wheeled into the courtroom on a small cart. Your Honor, David began as Judge Matthews called the session to order. I would like to present evidence that may clarify certain discrepancies in the financial documentation provided by the plaintiff's team. These materials were recently discovered during our investigation into the true origins of the assets in question, and I believe they will provide important context for this court's consideration. Thomas Blackwood's confident expression faltered slightly as he observed the unexpected development, his perfectly manicured hands shuffling through his own papers as though searching for some reference to documents that clearly had not been anticipated. Richard leaned forward in his seat, his previous swagger replaced by visible irritation as he watched David methodically organize materials that seemed far more comprehensive than anything the simple court-appointed lawyer should have possessed. The first document David presented was a series of banking records dating back to the early years of Richard and Margaret's marriage, records that showed financial patterns distinctly different from those presented the previous day. These statements revealed regular large deposits into accounts that Richard had characterized as solely funded by his business income, deposits that occurred with suspicious regularity and consistency that suggested sources beyond the consulting work he had claimed as his exclusive revenue stream. Your Honor, David explained with growing confidence, these banking records show that substantial capital was being deposited into Mr. Whitmore's business accounts throughout the first decade of their marriage, capital that does not correspond to the income levels reported on his tax returns for those years. The amounts are significant, ranging from $50,000 to $200,000 per quarter, far exceeding what his stated business activities could have generated. Richard's face began showing the first signs of genuine concern as he whispered urgently to Thomas Blackwood, his previous theatrical confidence replaced by something approaching panic. Jessica Carmichael's perpetual smile wavered as she realized that the proceedings were not following the script that had seemed so perfectly orchestrated just 24 hours earlier. The next series of documents proved even more troubling for Richard's narrative, as David presented correspondence between various financial institutions that revealed a complex pattern of asset transfers and account modifications that had occurred over the past 18 months. These documents showed that Richard had been systematically moving assets between accounts, changing ownership designations, and modifying beneficiary information in ways that suggested deliberate attempts to obscure the true origins of their accumulated wealth. Mr. Whitmore appears to have engaged in extensive financial restructuring during the period when this divorce was being contemplated, David continued, his voice growing stronger as he sensed the shifting dynamics in the courtroom. Bank records show that he transferred ownership of multiple investment accounts, changed property titles, and modified business partnership agreements, all within the 6 months immediately following Mrs. Whitmore's initial consultation with legal counsel about potential divorce proceedings. Margaret spoke for the first time since the proceedings began, her voice clear and steady as she requested permission to address a small discrepancy in Richard's testimony from the previous day. The courtroom fell silent as everyone strained to hear what the woman who had been characterized as intellectually limited and financially naive might have to contribute to these complex legal proceedings. Your Honor, Margaret said with quiet authority, yesterday my husband testified that he established Whitmore Enterprises in 1998 as his individual business venture. However, I believe there may be some confusion about the timeline, because I have documentation showing that the initial business registration occurred in 1996, under slightly different circumstances than he described. The collective intake of breath from Richard's legal team was audible as Margaret's simple correction revealed a level of attention to detail and factual knowledge that completely contradicted the narrative they had spent an entire day constructing. Thomas Blackwood's pen froze mid-note as he realized that the supposedly helpless housewife had just identified a factual error in testimony that he had assumed was unassailable. David Chen seized upon this opening with surprising agility, producing business registration documents that showed Whitmore Enterprises had indeed been established 2 years earlier than Richard had claimed, during a period when his income would have been insufficient to provide the startup capital that the business required. These documents raised immediate questions about where the initial funding had originated and why Richard had misrepresented such a basic fact about his own company's founding. Furthermore, Your Honor, David continued with growing momentum, we have discovered that the initial business loan that funded Whitmore Enterprises was secured using collateral that Mr. Whitmore did not own individually. The loan documents clearly show that the collateral consisted of property and assets that were already held in joint ownership, which would suggest that Mrs. Whitmore's consent and participation were legally required for the business establishment that Mr. Whitmore has characterized as his individual achievement. Richard's business partners Vincent Hartwell and Marcus Sterling began exhibiting visible discomfort as they realized their previous testimony might have been based on incomplete or inaccurate information. Vincent's confident assertions about Richard's independent business development were suddenly undermined by documentation suggesting that the foundational business decisions had involved joint marital assets from the very beginning. The most devastating revelation came when David presented investment portfolio statements that showed a pattern of funding that completely contradicted Richard's claims about the sources of their accumulated wealth. These documents revealed that major investment decisions throughout their marriage had been funded by regular capital infusions that originated from accounts Richard had never mentioned during his extensive testimony about building his business empire through individual effort and superior judgment. Your Honor, these investment records show that between 1997 and 2010, approximately $3.2 million was transferred into various business and investment accounts controlled by Mr. Whitmore, David explained as the courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense. These transfers occurred with such regularity and consistency that they appear to represent systematic funding rather than the sporadic business profits that Mr. Whitmore described in his testimony yesterday. Margaret's sister Helen looked genuinely shocked as she realized that her testimony about Margaret's financial limitations might have been based on carefully maintained appearances rather than actual capability. The confusion on Helen's face suggested that she was beginning to question everything she thought she knew about her sister's role in the marriage and her understanding of business matters. Judge Matthews leaned forward with obvious interest as the scope of the discrepancies became clear, his previous sympathy for Richard's position replaced by judicial concern about testimony that was beginning to appear deliberately misleading. The courtroom observers who had spent the previous day looking at Margaret with pity were now exchanging uncertain glances as they tried to reconcile the documentation being presented with the narrative they had accepted so completely. Jessica Carmichael's confident demeanor cracked visibly as she began to understand that the financial security she had been promised might be built on foundations that were far more complex and questionable than Richard had ever indicated. Her frequent glances toward the exit suggested that she was beginning to reconsider her position in whatever post-divorce future she had been planning. Thomas Blackwood requested a brief recess to confer with his client, his previous commanding presence replaced by obvious frustration as he realized that his carefully constructed case was being undermined by evidence that should have been discovered during routine investigation. Richard's whispered conference with his legal team grew increasingly heated as the implications of the mysterious documents became clear. Margaret remained seated calmly throughout the chaos surrounding her, her expression unchanged by the dramatic shift in courtroom dynamics that her simple timeline correction had initiated. Her notebook lay closed on the table before her, but her quiet confidence suggested that the documents being presented represented only the beginning of revelations that would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of the true financial picture. As the recess was called, Richard stood unsteadily from his chair, his previous swagger completely absent as he faced the possibility that his narrative about building an independent business empire might be thoroughly dismantled by documentation he had apparently forgotten existed. The man who had spent 25 years telling everyone that Margaret understood nothing about business was about to discover that she might have understood far more than anyone had ever imagined. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as David Chun approached the judge's bench carrying a manila folder that seemed to contain the weight of 25 years of carefully concealed truth. Richard Whitmore's face had drained of color during the brief recess, and his expensive legal team huddled around him like generals realizing their battle plan had been based on fundamentally flawed intelligence about enemy capabilities and positioning. Your Honor, David began with newfound authority that commanded immediate attention from everyone present. I am about to present documentation that will fundamentally alter this court's understanding of asset ownership in this marriage. These documents were secured from the original business registration files, banking institutions, and legal archives that apparently were never consulted during Mr. Whitmore's preparation of his financial disclosures. The first bombshell came in the form of original incorporation papers for Whitmore Enterprises, documents that bore signatures and legal language that completely contradicted every word of Richard's confident testimony from the previous day. As David read the founding documents aloud, the courtroom fell into stunned silence that grew heavier with each devastating revelation about the true ownership structure of the business empire Richard had claimed as his individual achievement. According to these original incorporation documents filed with the state in 1996, Whitmore Enterprises was established as a joint venture between Richard Whitmore and Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, with Mrs. Whitmore designated as the majority shareholder holding 65% ownership stake, while Mr. Whitmore held 35%. Furthermore, all major business decisions were required to have written approval from Mrs. Whitmore as the controlling partner. The collective gasp that arose from the courtroom observers was audible even over the sound of Thomas Blackwood's frantic shuffling through documents as he searched desperately for any reference to the business structure that was being revealed. Richard slumped in his chair as though the air had been physically knocked from his lungs, his previous arrogance replaced by the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. Margaret sat motionless throughout this revelation, her calm demeanor suggesting that she had been aware of these facts throughout the entire proceeding and had simply been waiting for the appropriate moment to allow the truth to emerge. Her quiet confidence now seemed less like resignation and more like the patience of someone who knew exactly how the story would end. But, Your Honor, the revelations become even more significant when we examine the source of the initial capital that funded this business venture, David continued, producing a series of bank documents that traced the money trail back to its original source. The startup funding for Whitmore Enterprises, totaling $800,000, came entirely from a trust fund established by Margaret's deceased parents, Harold and Elizabeth Morrison, specifically for their daughter's use in business investments and entrepreneurial activities. Jessica Carmichael's face went white as she realized that the business success she had been celebrating and the future financial security she had been promised were built entirely on Margaret's family money rather than Richard's business acumen. Her expensive designer outfits suddenly seemed like costume jewelry as the foundation of her anticipated lifestyle crumbled before her eyes. The documentation becomes even more compelling when we examine property ownership, David announced, producing a thick folder of real estate documents that would prove even more devastating to Richard's claims. The family mansion that Mr. Whitmore has been living in and that he characterized as his personal asset purchased through his business success was actually acquired using funds from Mrs. Whitmore's inheritance, and the original deed lists Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore as the sole owner of the property. Richard's business partners Vincent Hartwell and Marcus Sterling exchanged horrified glances as they began to understand that their testimony about Margaret's irrelevance to business operations might have unknowingly constituted perjury, given that they had apparently been completely unaware of her actual legal status as the controlling shareholder in ventures they had assumed Richard owned independently. The vacation home in Aspen that Mr. Whitmore described as his reward for successful business negotiations was purchased entirely with proceeds from Mrs. Whitmore's trust fund in 1999, David continued relentlessly. The beach house in Malibu that has been used for business entertaining was acquired using a loan secured by Mrs. Whitmore's inheritance assets. Even the yacht that Mr. Whitmore and Ms. Carmichael have been planning to use for their Mediterranean cruise is registered under Mrs. Whitmore's name as the legal owner. Thomas Blackwood finally found his voice, rising to object with desperate urgency to the systematic destruction of his client's case. Your Honor, these documents appear to contradict information that was provided to us by our client during case preparation. We request time to authenticate these materials and investigate any discrepancies between these findings and the financial disclosures we received. Judge Matthews denied the request with barely concealed irritation, pointing out that the documents being presented were original government filings and official banking records that should have been discovered during any competent investigation of marital assets. His tone suggested growing concern about the apparent gaps between Richard's sworn testimony and the documentary evidence being revealed. The investment portfolio that has generated the family's substantial wealth over the past 15 years was funded entirely by systematic transfers from Mrs. Whitmore's family trust, David announced, producing quarterly statements that showed a pattern of capital infusion that completely contradicted Richard's claims about building wealth through business profits. Mrs. Whitmore's trust fund contributed over $4.7 million to various investment accounts that Mr. Whitmore has characterized as the fruits of his individual business expertise. Margaret finally rose from her chair, approaching the witness stand with the fluid grace of someone who had been waiting 25 years for this moment of vindication. Her transformation from defeated housewife to confident businesswoman was so complete that several courtroom observers struggled to recognize her as the same person they had been pitying just hours earlier. Your Honor, Margaret began with quiet authority that commanded immediate attention. I allowed my husband to manage the day-to-day operations of businesses that were built using my family's capital because I believed that marriage meant partnership and mutual support. Unfortunately, over time he began to believe his own narrative about being the sole creator of our wealth, and he apparently forgot that every major asset he claims to own was purchased with money that my parents left specifically for my financial security. The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Margaret continued her testimony, her voice growing stronger as she revealed the careful documentation she had maintained throughout 25 years of systematic financial manipulation. She had copies of every trust fund disbursement, records of every property purchase, documentation of every business investment that had been funded with her inheritance, while Richard took credit for the strategic thinking behind decisions that were legally hers to make. I have spent the past 2 years working with financial investigators to trace every dollar of my family's money that was used to build what my husband characterizes as his business empire, Margaret explained with devastating calm. The trust fund established by my parents contained over $12 million when I inherited it at age 21. That money has been systematically invested in properties and businesses that my husband now claims to own independently, but the paper trail clearly shows the true source of all our accumulated wealth. Richard sat frozen in his chair as the scope of his deception became clear to everyone present. The man who had spent decades convincing friends, business partners, and apparently himself that he was a self-made millionaire was being exposed as someone who had built his entire identity on a foundation of borrowed money and false claims about his own financial contributions to the marriage. Jessica Carmichael gathered her designer purse and fled the courtroom as she realized that the wealthy businessman she had planned to marry was actually a fraud who owned nothing and whose future prospects had just evaporated along with his credibility. Her departure was swift and final, leaving Richard to face the consequences of his elaborate deception without even the support of the woman for whom he had destroyed his marriage. "Your Honor," Margaret concluded with quiet dignity, "my husband has been living off my family's money for 25 years while telling everyone who would listen that I was too simple to understand business. Today I am asking this court to return control of my assets to me so that I can finally make decisions about investments and properties that were always legally mine to begin with." The revelation was complete, and the silence that followed was profound as everyone present struggled to process the complete reversal of everything they had believed about Margaret's role in the marriage and Richard's claims to business success. The woman who had been dismissed as intellectually limited and financially dependent had just proven that she was actually the source of all the wealth that had enabled Richard's arrogant lifestyle and cruel dismissal of her supposed inadequacies. Thomas Blackwood sat in stunned silence, his expensive legal education apparently insufficient to prepare him for the complete collapse of a case he had considered unwinnable just hours earlier. Richard remained motionless in his chair, finally understanding that his 25-year campaign to diminish Margaret's intelligence and business capabilities had been a catastrophic miscalculation that was about to cost him everything he had spent decades falsely claiming to own. Judge Matthews sat in contemplative silence for several moments, his weathered hands steepled before him as he absorbed the magnitude of the evidence that had completely transformed the proceedings from what had appeared to be a straightforward asset division into something approaching fraud investigation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of judicial authority backed by undeniable documentary proof of systematic deception. Based on the evidence presented to this court, Judge Matthews announced with grave finality, "I find that Mr. Richard Whitmore has engaged in deliberate misrepresentation of asset ownership, attempted conversion of marital property, and perjury during sworn testimony. All assets currently held under Mr. Whitmore's name are hereby restored to their rightful owner, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, effective immediately." The gavel's sound echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap, marking the complete destruction of Richard's carefully constructed fiction and the restoration of financial control to the woman he had spent 25 years dismissing as intellectually incapable of understanding business. Richard's head dropped into his hands as the full scope of his defeat became clear, his previous arrogance replaced by the hollow expression of a man who had gambled everything on a lie and lost catastrophically. Furthermore, Judge Matthews continued with obvious displeasure at having been misled by false testimony. "Mr. Whitmore is ordered to pay all legal fees associated with this proceeding, including costs incurred by Mrs. Whitmore's investigation into the true ownership of assets that were deliberately concealed from this court. Additionally, Mr. Whitmore will be reported to the State Bar Association for potential disciplinary action against any attorney who knowingly participated in this deceptive presentation." Thomas Blackwood's face went ashen as he realized that his professional reputation might be permanently damaged by his association with Richard's fraudulent claims, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like the costume of a performer whose act had been thoroughly exposed. The attorney who had entered the courtroom expecting easy victory now faced potential ethics investigations and career consequences that could extend far beyond this single case. Vincent Hartwell and Marcus Sterling rose from their seats and moved quickly toward the exit, clearly eager to distance themselves from the spectacular collapse of Richard's credibility and the potential legal implications of their unwitting participation in what now appeared to be systematic fraud. Their previous confident testimony about Richard's business acumen now seemed like evidence of their own professional incompetence or willful blindness. Margaret remained poised at the defendant table as the courtroom slowly emptied around her, watching as Richard's entire support system dissolved in real time. His business partners abandoned him. His attorney began gathering documents with obvious plans for immediate withdrawal from the case, and the courtroom observers who had spent 2 days looking at her with pity now regarded Richard with the mixture of fascination and revulsion reserved for spectacular public failures. The most revealing moment came when Margaret finally addressed the court directly, her voice carrying 25 years of suppressed intelligence and carefully concealed strategic thinking. "Your Honor," she began with quiet dignity that commanded immediate attention, "I want this court to understand that my silence during this marriage was not evidence of intellectual limitation, but rather a calculated decision to document my husband's systematic appropriation of my family's assets while he convinced everyone, including himself, that he was the source of our wealth." Her words carried devastating impact as she explained how she had spent years meticulously documenting every financial transaction, every business decision, every property acquisition that Richard had executed using her inheritance, while taking full credit for the strategic thinking behind investments that were legally and morally hers to control. Her supposed financial ignorance had been an elaborate performance designed to give Richard enough rope to hang himself with his own arrogance and dishonesty. "I maintained detailed records of every dollar from my trust fund that was used to build the business empire my husband claimed as his individual achievement," Margaret continued with calm authority. "I documented every instance where he took credit for investment decisions that were funded entirely by my family's money. I recorded every occasion where he publicly dismissed my intelligence while privately depending on my financial resources to maintain the lifestyle that supported his elaborate fiction about being self-made." The few remaining observers sat in stunned silence as Margaret revealed the scope of her strategic patience, explaining how she had deliberately maintained the appearance of helplessness while gathering evidence that would ultimately expose the true source of Richard's supposed business success. Her performance as a submissive, financially ignorant housewife had been so convincing that even her own family had believed the narrative Richard had constructed about her limitations. Richard finally found his voice, attempting a desperate plea for understanding that fell on deaf ears as the magnitude of his deception became clear to everyone present. "Margaret, please, you have to understand that I was trying to protect you from the complexities of business management. I never intended to deceive anyone about the source of our capital. I just thought it would be easier if I handled all the financial decisions while you focused on domestic responsibilities." Margaret's response was swift and devastating in its quiet precision. "Richard," she replied with the tone of someone addressing a particularly slow student, "you convinced yourself that managing my money made you intelligent, while systematically convincing everyone else that my inability to speak at business meetings meant I was incapable of understanding finance. You forgot that silence can be a choice rather than a limitation, and that observation is often more valuable than participation." The bailiff approached Richard's table to explain the immediate practical consequences of the court's ruling, informing him that he would need to vacate the family mansion within 48 hours and return all business assets to Margaret's control by the end of the week. Richard's face crumpled as he realized that the luxurious lifestyle he had enjoyed for decades would disappear as quickly as his fraudulent claims to ownership. Judge Matthews concluded the proceedings by addressing Margaret directly, his tone reflecting newfound respect for a woman whose intelligence and strategic thinking had been systematically underestimated by everyone present. "Mrs. Whitmore, The court commends your patience and thorough documentation of these financial irregularities. Your evidence has prevented a significant miscarriage of justice and serves as a reminder that appearances can be profoundly misleading when carefully constructed by intelligent individuals. As Margaret gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the courthouse, she paused to address the few remaining observers with words that would be remembered long after the legal proceedings were forgotten. For 25 years, she announced with quiet satisfaction, my husband told everyone who would listen that I was too simple to understand his business success. Today I hope you understand that sometimes the most intelligent strategy is allowing others to underestimate you until the moment arrives to prove them catastrophically wrong. 3 months later, Margaret had resumed active control of her business empire, implementing strategic decisions that increased the value of her investments by 30% within the first quarter of her renewed involvement. Richard was working as a junior consultant for a firm that paid him less in annual salary than he had once spent on Jessica's jewelry, living in a modest apartment and struggling to rebuild a professional reputation that had been destroyed by his own arrogance and dishonesty. The story became legendary in their social circles as an example of how completely someone's true capabilities could be hidden behind carefully maintained appearances. Margaret's transformation from dismissed housewife to respected businesswoman served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating people based on their willingness to remain silent rather than their ability to speak. The final irony was perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the entire reversal. Richard, who had spent 25 years claiming that Margaret's contributions to their marriage had no economic value, discovered that without access to her trust fund and business acumen, his own economic value was essentially non-existent. The man who had dismissed his wife as a financial dependent learned that he had actually been the dependent party throughout their entire marriage, surviving on the wealth and intelligence of the woman he had systematically ridiculed for a quarter century.